In this short video presentation, I'd like to talk about language planning. Usually we think of languages as something that evolve over time, but there are a number of very different ways that we plan languages. And some of these ways are formal, organized, and well-funded. Others are more ad hoc and grassroots. One of them is the Académie Française. In 1634, language use in France was changing. At this time, French was beginning to be used for functions formerly served by Latin. One of these functions, formerly served by Latin, was education. While most schools continued to use Latin as the language of instruction, a few were beginning to use French. The emergence of French into these new roles meant that it had to be codified. Grammars and dictionaries were needed. It was in this context that the Académie Française emerged. The impulse to codify the language was felt by the social elite. This social elite were busying themselves in the salon culture, which brought together aristocrats and writers in the homes of gentlemen or ladies. The aristocrats brought the money, and the writers brought the style. One of these groups met at the home of a book collector, and it consisted mostly of writers, and the topic was almost always related to language and literature. Cardinal Richelieu, hearing of this club, basically took it over, making it an official body, the goal of which was to give explicit rules to our language and to render it pure, eloquent, and capable of treating the arts and science. And this, what began as a salon in the home of a book collector, became one of the best known and most respected of the world's language academies. Here we see an example of language planning that grew out of a particular context and was formed around a specific goal. It was centralized, organized, and well-funded. A very different example of language planning would be the social movement that seeks to make English a more gender-neutral and less explicitly sexist language. As with the Académie Française, this movement can be placed in a specific context. The desire for a less sexist language emerges repeatedly, but it really got going with the growth of the women's movement and the recognition within feminism of sexism as an everyday social and cultural phenomenon. The Académie Française was partly a response to the French language entering different social spheres. The movement for less sexist language was partly a response to women entering different social spheres. Where there are feminist organizations that pay attention to language, there's no one single organization, unlike the Académie Française. Some of these organizations may be well-funded, and some may get government funding, but unlike the Académie, this example of language planning is decentralized and for the most part grassroots. The women's movement shows us that social movements have linguistic consequences. Whether or not such consequences influence non-linguistic behavior, it has, in any event, proven easier to change written language, or written usage, than to change the practices and attitudes that subordinate women. This is written by Cooper in his book on language planning and social change. So these two examples of language planning both paid attention to the lexicon. One was to prescribe language that was correct, the other was to propose language that was less sexist. The Académie Française also attended to syntax and rhetoric. My third example of language planning involves the promotion of the language in its entirety. Language planning in Quebec has aimed at ensuring that French would remain and become even more strongly rooted as the language of the province. Rather than prescribing a standard of the language, it's taken the form of prescribing the language. Laws ensure that most Quebec children are educated in French, and that French is the dominant language of the workplace. It is seen internationally as a successful example of language planning, and is often emulated in other countries. I'm going to set this one aside for a bit, because one of the tasks I'm going to ask of you is to flesh it out, and do a little research and talk and write back about what forms this example of language planning take and have taken. I want you to talk to me about language planning in Quebec. Some of you may have strong opinions one way or the other on this example of language planning, either in favor or opposed or a mix of both, but I'd like you to look at it as linguists and set your personal opinions aside. With any example of language planning, we can ask a number of questions. Who wants this language planning to take place? Who benefits from the proposals? Whose language is being affected? Where is it to take place? Why is it desirable? Why is it happening now? Or why did it happen when it did? How is the planning being implemented? And what aspects of language are being planned? I'm going to leave it to you to answer some of these questions about Quebec. I'm going to introduce my fourth example of language planning with reference to the invention of the writing system Hangul. And in introducing this example of language planning, I'll organize it around some of those questions. In the 1440s, Korea was a monarchy led by King Sejong, but it had a very well-educated and influential aristocracy. The king's power was not absolute. The people spoke Korean, but depended upon a Chinese-based writing system, which for most people would have required formal study to learn. Those who could not afford a formal education usually remained illiterate. So, who wants this language planning to take place? King Sejong proposed a new writing system. Popular belief has it that he personally invented it, but in truth he established a committee of linguists who researched the needs and the possibilities and proposed an alphabet as the solution. Who wanted this language planning to take place? King Sejong. These linguists were opposed by the aristocracy, who saw their status as an elite and their control over information threatened if literacy became widespread. What aspects of language were being planned? The focus was entirely on the writing system with some attention to pronunciation. Who benefits from these proposals? Whose language is being affected? Well, the benefits are wide-ranging. The scholars believed that with an alphabet, women and poor people would be able to read, and that this would have social benefits. It would also allow for the power of the monarchy to spread to the countryside, where even many government officials were not fully literate, and so couldn't understand what the laws and edicts of the king were saying. Society as a whole was to benefit, but it did challenge those who were in power. Where is it to take place, and how is it being implemented? The writing system and instructions for its use were disseminated throughout the kingdom through a text called Hunmun Jongum, which means the correct sounds for the instruction of the people. Why is it desirable? An alphabet offers a number of advantages, particularly in a society where access to education is limited. It's much easier for people to learn the consonants and vowels of the Korean alphabet. I believe there's something like 24 consonants and 9 vowels. Than to learn the 1800 Chinese characters needed for basic literacy. Why is it happening now? Or why did it happen when it did? Actually, it didn't. The language planning took place, but it was shelved. It challenged the aristocracy and was publicly maligned. The Yangban, the aristocrats, said that adopting Hangul would be an embarrassment for Koreans in the eyes of their Chinese neighbors. The Hangul alphabet didn't begin to become accepted until hundreds of years later, after Korean became a Japanese colony. At that time, using this alphabet became an act of Korean nationalism and resistance to Japanese rule and anti-colonialism. The alphabet that was unacceptable to the political elite in 1446 became the way of pushing back against colonial Japan in 1920. So, with those 4 examples in mind, here is Cooper's definition of language planning. Language planning refers to deliberate efforts to influence the behavior of others with respect to the acquisition, structure, or functional allocation of their language codes. If you think about the 4 examples I've given, you can see that this definition manages to include all of them, despite their differences. There are different types of language planning that takes place. One is corpus planning. Corpus planning involves adding to the lexicon, changing spelling, adopting a new script. Why do corpus planning? You might change the spelling to make reading easier. There have been some largely unsuccessful attempts to make English easier to read. You might do corpus planning to expand the lexicon to include technical terms. You might adopt a new script, as was done in Korea, or attempted in Korea, to help spread literacy. You might add to the lexicon when you're revitalizing a language that's fallen out of use hundreds of years ago might not have the vocabulary necessary to describe a modern world. Another type of language planning is status planning. This involves changing the status of the language in society, and it may involve making laws, as in the example of French in laws regarding French in Quebec. But it could also involve promoting the production of literature in the language, which also happened in Quebec, or producing dictionaries and grammars, as happened with both English and French several centuries ago when they began to replace Latin as the language of education in England and France, and also happened with French in Quebec, much more recently. Another type of language planning is acquisition planning, and this might involve promoting the teaching and learning of the language. In the late 90s, the government of China began to fund international language schools with the goal of promoting Mandarin as an international language. In Quebec, students in teacher education programs are required to take a language test, either the TEC-FE for French or the EETC for English. Such a test attempts to ensure that a certain level of language is acquired and then taught in the school system. Also consider, in Quebec, the St. Lambert experiment, which started when English-speaking parents worried about their children's inability to learn French in school. This resulted, eventually, in what became the French immersion programs throughout Canada, and it's been used as an example of success by people arguing for bilingual Spanish-English schooling in the United States. So this is an example of acquisition planning that started in Montreal and became spread across Canada, and in some ways is influencing American language education as well. So, 3 types: corpus planning, status planning, and acquisition planning. Corpus planning changes the body of the language in some way. Status planning attempts to change the social views of, or the community's use of, the language. And acquisition planning is used to ensure that the language is known and can be used. The first addresses what the language is. The second addresses how the language is perceived. And the third addresses who has the ability to use the language.